40 years on, I couldn't have predicted what it was going to be like. I am glad that it has continued to grow rather than withering away and disappearing. Equally, I find it difficult to predict what it'll be like in another 40 years.
I mean, one of the big advantages of being coming 40 years, you know all the bodies are buried.
We've covered a great deal of areas of computing archaeology in our time, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
It's not only about a professional network, but as one of the people from the audience also said, it's really a group of friends.
So it's very good to be brought back in touch, to meet people I hadn't seen for years, some of them, and generally just to get to feel again the buzz of what's going on.
It's always nice to see the people, the creative force around which has led the industry of computer-based archaeology.
I know, because I have the evidence, that I presented a paper at the 82 conference, and I have the evidence with me here. I have the conference badge, a historical artefact in its own right.
I've been coming to CAA since 1980, so that's a long time. It's longer than I would like to remember. And I know a lot of people here, but we never really sit down and talk about that aspect of it, the sort of history of it, and things we've done together and the impact it's had on our lives.
So the personal history session is part of a broader project organised by Pamela Smith, and my colleague Tom Brughmans contacted her initially, thinking that we should do something like this at the CAA. It's always been an extremely social conference, and we really felt that this needed to be reflected. On the 40th anniversary of the CAA, we wanted to bring some of the great memories and experiences that people have had of the CAA conference back into the event itself and to celebrate them.
In 1973, I started CAA with a day school, 74 a residential conference. It continued from that. In the 1960s, I was doing a higher degree in space research at University College. It had nothing to do with archaeology. If you want to know what happened before CAA, you will have to wait for John Wilcock. 1973, a single day, 1974 residential, it's continued to grow. I'm glad it has, because things either continue to grow or they fade away and disappear. However, the extent had me slightly surprised. This one is about 10 times the size, 8 parallel sessions, each one as large as the whole original conference, and there's all the signs that it will continue. What will happen when it gets too big for any single institution, I don't know. But we may have seen a clue this morning at breakfast time with the link up with Australia. If it continues to grow, we might at some time in the future have 2 or 3 conferences run in parallel at different places with a link up of that sort that people can go along to sit in on sessions at the other conference. Who knows? It's always rash to predict, but let's see what happens. Another change I've noticed is the way the technology has improved. It is now possible to actually do some of the things that were only wild ideas in the first conferences. Though in geophysics that is perhaps a little unfair, because even in 1974, Irwin Scollar was sending us a report of a large magnetometer survey outside Constantin, where he had surveyed a very large area showing the roads, the buildings, and the bomb craters from the war in a large area. And this is very similar to what you see on Time Team, where they say, show us the geophys of the site and we'll know where to dig. That idea has got over very well. There's a sheet which may be going round talking about what geophysics was like in the 1970s. CBA West Midlands had a max fleet magnetometer which they would lend to people who were prepared to do surveys. You would spend an entire weekend surveying a small section, carting this thing around, writing the results as numbers on a piece of paper. I speeded things up by writing them directly onto a computer input form, getting them punched onto cards, putting them through. You'd have to write your own Fortran programs to produce the images, putting them through that, getting them run overnight on the university mainframe, and if you managed to get back the next weekend with the output, that was regarded as unbelievably fast. those have changed considerably. Another change I've noticed, this is almost a circle in fact, is some of the ways of thinking. In America in the early 70s, there was a lot of talk about data banks, which would hold all the information from excavations available for anyone to access it. That was way beyond what any of the hardware could do. You then got a large period with different people doing database projects for a small area, and you had a lot of committees talking about standards so that you could exchange the data between these individual databases. Nowadays, with the World Wide Web and more stuff available on that, we're actually getting back to the data bank idea in the early 70s. So that is a case where the ways of thinking have shifted and have actually come full circle. One thing that has been not commented on and possibly not realized was the effect in the early days in which the computer system and the input format you had affected the whole of your design of the project you were working on. Generally speaking, and it's by no means universal, computers which originated in America used punched cards. You had fixed fields, 4 columns for something, 4 columns for something else, 6 columns for something, putting them onto these cards. They were then read into the computer. The languages available to you were Fortran or COBOL, and what you could do with those also affected the way in which you handled the data. The other group, mostly UK, though again not universally, used paper tape input, used languages like autocode and algol. They did not have fixed length formats. They had a variable length with a special character to denote the end of that field, and therefore the design of the way you handle the data was affected by this. I came across this on a project that I was working on in the 70s, the Shropshire Gazetteer project. It was actually an early SMR database, though such things had not been invented at the time we were doing it. We had designed generic types, 4-digit ones. As a result of the long discussions in the standards organization, they finished up with a hierarchical form of generic type, going to 6 or more digits. There was no way you could fit that into the 4 digits I had on my data cards. However, if you looked at the words, it was obvious that you could design a lookup table which would convert my 4-digit ones into these more general ones. So I decided, right, if anybody ever wants my output, I can provide such a lookup table and it can be converted into the standard format. But this was a case where the medium I was using affected the design of the project that I was working on. That was a very early one. As I say, it was before you had SMR databases. I had to store my files on a magnetic tape, and for each type of query, I had to write a separate Fortran program to read through the tape, extracting the relevant records, and then printing them out to give someone the piece of paper with the printout. It's much easier now when you've got... And in fact, most of that gazetteer is now available on an Access database. I've got it in my bag on a laptop. If anybody's curious, later on today, I could show them what it was. But things have continued to change, and I'm pleased to say that the conference has continued to grow. Thank you.
So I started the Personal Histories project so you could all hear personal stories of how archaeologists became archaeologists, how our discipline became what it is today, why it's the way it is today, what people believed, what people felt, whom they drank with, all the personal details that you never get in an academic paper. I thought that's the way to go.
Because it's the 40th anniversary of CAA. We basically decided to do a little bit of a celebration, and I think it was almost 2 years ago when I was thinking what would be kind of suitable to do that, and then I came across Pamela Jane Smith's Personal Histories project. I really liked the format. I liked all of the videos I saw of it beforehand, and I thought this is something that is perfectly applicable to CAA. And 40 years in a subdiscipline that basically draws on something that is always advances so fast, like computer science, and then something that can have an image of being static, like archaeology, and the mix, and having that evolve over 40 years. I thought that was fascinating. So I thought that was a great idea to host a personal history session, and I think we made it happen.
Today, what was happening today I thought was so incredibly touching, because there are all these stories about drinking together as friends, and what I was impressed, I don't know what you felt, but what really impressed me was that the CAA is very much a community, and very much a supportive community. There doesn't seem to be a lot of infighting and anger or jealousies. Did you notice? It's a very warm, supportive academic community, and that's not something you get very often.
Well, it's really interesting actually, because so many of them have gone into different fields and have done different things. So it's really interesting to see people who've had really successful careers and see what they've actually taken from the CAA and what they've actually managed to achieve through the CAA, but in the rest of their lives as well, and how it fits into their development. So yeah, no, it's been fantastic for that.
Well, my function of the first conference was a dog's body. Basically, although I'm carrying a badge saying that I'm a member of the University of Birmingham, I'm actually a member of the senior common room by marriage. I moved the chairs, and I'm very glad there weren't 600 chairs to move. One of the other jobs was going with a helper, a ravenous, salivating student to fetch the lunch from the local Colonel Sanders. That salivating student is now a senior lecturer in computer science at Manchester University. And the other one that was helping us out is unfortunately now a professor of history at Wolverhampton. We had a conference dinner as well. That provides some highlights. The one I remember most is one of our London members inquired of the landlady of the pub at which we were having the conference dinner what the red wine was, to which she replied, "The best." Now, my background was not in archaeology as such. My day job was in operations research, and I later moved over to my hobby of military history and started publishing and writing that. I had done a little computing in Pigeon RPG on an IBM 360, which was rather less powerful than my first computer I owned, which was a 16K Speccy. And I have programmed in BASIC and even in machine code in a very limited way, because you had to. I also did some archaeology. I worked on with a trowel at the Lunt, digging the Roman fort Baggington, and I also did geophys with Sue whipping me on at Roxeter. When the conference started, it was intended to bring computer specialists, computer scientists and archaeologists together. This was not an immediate obvious success. The computer scientists and archaeology faculty at Birmingham gave it little backing. The computer scientists thought that computing should be pure, not applied. And it was just Sue playing one of her hobbies. The archaeology faculty was terrified someone asked them to find out what a computer was. There was one member of the faculty, however, who did take an interest in having a computer on his own site, and this led to Birmingham University buying its first micro, a 32K PET. In fact, they didn't buy it, they shared it with another university, so they had half a 32K PET. The conference attendees were thus wild revolutionaries. They were not mainstream computer scientists. They were not mainstream archaeologists. They were people that liked archaeology and liked computers. But this was a time when archaeologists didn't even talk to historians, and vice versa. You might see a little of this today when, for example, if you watch Time Team, you'll find often an archaeologist is far more keen on opening up the trenches left by previous archaeologists 20 years ago than he was actually reading their site reports. Yep. No, yes. Oh, yes, and I should not forget to mention that the only paper that I have ever produced in my life that has actually got itself into a bibliography was the one I produced here in 1973. And there are still some. Well, there are such a large number of reprints of that article still available. If anyone is desperately interested in the typology for the metal projectile points, I'm happy to pass them on to make more sense at home. Yeah, one thing I find is that although I've written several books and countless articles, that was the only one I've ever had that has actually been referenced in another archaeological academic publication. And this is possibly because they thought it was by Philip Arthur Barker and not by Philip Charles Barker. Just to confuse things even more, I did do footnotes for him on weapon points in his Rockster report. So he's not footnoting himself. This is the general thing I think you might bear in mind, that archaeologists and historians are not very good at acknowledging people who are non-academics and their contributions. They seem to feel that it denigrates them to have to say it. They got the idea from someone else who isn't an academic. The other point that comes up constantly, which is worth bearing in mind, is every now and then someone produces a new theory in history or archaeology, and quite often you have to wait for a department head to die before this will happen, because the only time, apart from that, the only time you will find anyone actually agreeing with what has been done before them is when it's their department head who wrote it. No one gets promoted by saying they were all right. And that is it, gentlemen and ladies.
Attended one session of the CAA. It was back in 1977, which is of course a very long time ago, more distant than the Stone Age. And there are differences, of course. At the time the CAA was held in Birmingham, it was a minuscule affair, a one-day affair, or 2 days, I cannot remember exactly.
This is reliving my past in a way, because I've always had an interest in computing and statistics, which then combined with my interest in archaeology, and the two aspects were converged. So I was in on the first CAA in '73.
I feel great satisfaction that it's still continuing to thrive.
But of course I, in a way, have a nostalgia for those days in those 2 days in Birmingham. In general, for meetings of 30, 40 pioneering people. That of course created an atmosphere, which today is harder to find because there are few fields or subfields or subfields in archaeology allowing that kind of closely knit, interacting small group. So that's something you miss, but you know, it's part of growing. Things are growing, things are changing, words are changing, and of course it's very pleasant and exhilarating to see the CAA in its present growth.
Although CAA started sort of officially in 1973, there were obviously things going on before then and in a wider context in terms of archaeologists having an interest in computers and statistical methods, and also in statisticians and other non-archaeologists seeing archaeology as an interesting application area and wanting to get involved in that. Our next speaker is John Wilcock, who started the Research Centre for Computer Archaeology in Staffordshire Polytechnic, as it was then, and indeed several of us here have benefited from John's initiative and did our PhDs there. But John was also involved in the very first days of CAA in various ways, and I think John is going to partially give a sort of few words about the wider context of archaeological computing during the early 1970s, and indeed perhaps even the 60s.
Everybody hear me at that level? Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to take you back to 1948 because in 1948, I was 11 years old at the time. I was first introduced to archaeology, and that was my parents taking me to Hadrian's Wall. And this subject fascinated me, and it's been with me all my life. The next thing I had to decide was, well, what am I going to study at school? Now, I thought, well, perhaps I'll be a professional archaeologist. It's so fascinating. But on the other hand, I looked into the sort of salary levels that archaeologists got, and I thought, well, perhaps not. Perhaps I can do better than that. So I studied science at school. Before going to the University of Oxford. Now, in those days, people of my age had to do national service. So, when I became 18, I went into the Royal Air Force for 2 years. I spent over a full year being trained, and only 2 years of service. And in that time, I became a radar person. So I learnt all about electronics in the RAF. Then I went to University of Oxford and I studied physics there. But there I came across Martin Aitken. Now, those of you who know who Martin Aitken is or was in those days, he was in the research laboratory for archaeology and the history of art at Oxford, and he concentrated on using things like Martin Clark resistivity meters and proton gradiometers, which had been invented by the Research Centre for Archaeology at Oxford. And so a lot of the influence came from him, from Martin Aitken. There were also a long series of archaeometry conferences well before CAA, and I went to many of those. So, passing on then, what happened after Oxford? Well, I now knew physics besides electronics, and I thought, well, a very good thing to go into would be the computer industry. Because in those days, 1961, the first generation computers were on call, and long before the days of micros, of course. So first generation computers then, and I became a computer engineer for English Electric. Now that gave me access to first generation computers and later on second generation computers, KDF9s. These were huge machines, would fill a room this size with cubicles, and of course were not very portable, were they? But I still use those mainframe computers for archaeological purposes on the sly, in particular for geophysical work, which I'd learnt from Martin Aitken, but I did quite a lot of geophys work with local archaeological societies. And then I may be, I'm not quite sure about this, I may be the first British person to transmit geophysical data from one of these mainframe computers elsewhere. So maybe that happened about 1965, 1966. Well, in 1969, having been trained in computing, I thought, well, I'd really like to teach computing. So I went to what was then the Staffordshire College of Technology. Now that then became part of North Staffordshire Polytechnic, a big organisation. To start with, there were 10 lecturers in computing and 1 technician in the department. This rapidly grew to 100 lecturers in computing and 30 technicians, and of course a throughput of about 2,000 computing students a year. So you can see that the size of that organisation. Well, having been in at the first stages of it, I became a research leader. But before that, I had to do my doctorate, of course, which I got in 1972. And you'd be surprised at the title of it, because it was very, very general, and it was called Computing Applications in Archaeology. That was the title of my PhD thesis. I could do that in those days. So, having got the doctorate, they said, all right, well, research leader now. So, I was a research leader in a big organisation. I had access to hundreds of computers of all different sizes and makes, and access to research grants. So I thought, well, what shall I do with these research grants? So I thought, well, let's do computing applications in archaeology. So what I did was I looked around for archaeologists. Now, these were archaeologists who had no computer training. So I drafted them in, I interviewed them. Anybody who had a spark about them, I took and trained them all in computing. Now, you can see several of them here today. I had more than 20 PhD students in that line over the years. We have Gary here. We have Paul, who actually defected to IBM, but he used IBM graphics in particular for his work. We have Nick here, who was CAA chairman some while ago. And in the background over there, we have 2 more. We have Julian D. Richards from York, and Jeremy Huggett, of course, who took the keynote speech at the beginning of this conference. I won't mention any others. Oh, yes, just one I'll mention. That is Malcolm Cooper, who is Chief Inspector for Historic Scotland. So that's the sort of calibre people I've had around me, and I'm extremely grateful for their support, I must say. So we've covered a great deal of areas of computing archaeology in our time, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity. I'm just going to tail off now, really, by giving my few thoughts about which direction this conference is now going. In 1973, we decided that it was necessary to have a national Computing and Archaeology Conference, CAA, and of course we joined up with Sue, and the first conferences were in Birmingham. And then after a while we began to tour around Britain to places like Bradford and Southampton, York and so on, wherever there were archaeology departments who wanted some development of archaeology, moved around, and then of course the conference became international, as it should have done. And now it's a vast size, at least 10 times bigger than we started off. So I think that's some sort of success. I think also that the number of PhD students I had was some sort of success. But I think maybe the best success is that archaeologists nowadays expect to use computers. Now, this only happened once there were portable computers, that is microcomputers. Now, the first microcomputer that I used to carry around in my camping van to various archaeological sites with a petrol-driven generator, and ran it on various archaeological sites. That was in the 1980s. Went to places like South Cadbury, of course, also to with Barry Cunliffe at Danebury, where Gary worked a lot in Danebury, and numerous other sites. We went around with this camping van to various archaeological sites doing computing. And now, of course, every archaeologist now uses a microcomputer, and I think that's some sort of success too. I'm going to just say a few more remarks. That is to do with archiving. We must archive all this work. Well, we can start off by archiving all the printed copies that we've got. I'll leave with you the thought that the paper archive must continue. We've had paper printed records for 2,000 years now, and they've been preserved. Nowadays, we cannot read punch cards, we cannot read punch paper tape, we can't read large magnetic discs, we can't read floppy disks, and this came to a real head with the BBC 1986 Doomsday Project. By the skin of our teeth, we rescued that data, which had been assembled by over 1 million people. And it was in danger of disappearing entirely because we couldn't read the optical disc it was on. And we've done that with Cambridge, and it's now preserved. So I leave you with that thought. Preserve the archive at all costs. We can't use the cloud unless we can read it. Thank you.
The conference is a community, it's a bunch of people who like to talk, unfortunately about computers and archaeology, but they do like to talk, and gathering together some of those social stories and keeping them so that they don't fade away out of memory. Because 40 years is a lot of time, and there's a lot of people there that have done entertaining things that we'd like to keep hold of.
All good knowledge comes out of a beer. All good knowledge comes out of sitting down when you're not trying to think. That's when you create. It's when you're having a cup of tea.
Yeah, it was good. The old reminiscences of the various good things and the various disasters that happened, and the dreadful plum brandy, which was really stuck in my mind from being force-fed plum brandy in a coach that you couldn't get out of. Really quite scary, yeah.
Quite a lot of the stories were about me doing things, just remembering those items that involved me and other people forgetting what they'd done on the basis that they'd been with me in a city somewhere in the world, and I have the only secrets left.
It brings back lots of memory, and even after the session we just had, people keep on talking about, do you remember this and do you remember that, and those kind of things. So that's very nice. And there are a lot of stories people are not willing to tell in the room over there, but are being told now over at the table there and things like that. So you should try to corner as many people as possible and ask them about their secret stories.
It's just great, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to promote excessive alcohol, but yeah, the social side of it is a big part of CAA, really. But I don't want to underplay the intellectual side of it. You know, there's a lot of cutting-edge research is presented here, and as I mentioned in there somewhere, it's also the interdisciplinarity of it. So, I mean, this is one of the few, if not the only archaeological conference where you can meet leading computer scientists, computer graphics people, statisticians, that whole range of expertise. I'm now going to pass over to Hans Kamermans, who I've already mentioned that right at the beginning of CAA, and certainly if you look at the 75 proceedings, there's a whole range of countries that provided people who were interested in these things. And Hans is going to give a bit of a perspective on the international aspect of CAA, I think. Are you? Yeah. Hans told me that he couldn't remember when he first came to CAA. It's that long ago, in the mists of time, but we think it's probably the early 1980s.
Can you hear me? Yes, more or less? Okay. There's a lot I can't remember, so I did bring the minutes of all the AGMs and all the steering committee. So I'm not going to read them. Not in 10 minutes, not again. Okay, I was the first non-UK elected member of the steering committee, but that doesn't mean that I was the first non-UK member of the steering committee. As you all know, the CAA conference in Aarhus in Denmark was the first conference abroad. So the two organizers of that conference were the first non-UK members of the steering committee. There also is Professor Ozawa from Japan, and he was a member of the steering committee for a certain period of time. Nobody remembers why, as far as I know. I'm not supposed to ask you any questions. Nobody knows why he was a member. But how did CAA go international? The first suggestion you can find in the minutes of the AGM in 1989 in York, when the chairman, Clive Orton, suggested for a venue for 1992 was sought preferably in the north of UK or in Europe. Of course, the UK not being Europe then and not being Europe now. But that was not easy because, as a lot of you know, nobody in his right mind organizes a CAA conference. So he really had to twist some people's arms, and that was Torsten Madsen and Jens Andresen, and they were willing to organize the conference in Denmark, in Aarhus. But it was a close call. In 1992, the AGM voted on this, going to Denmark, and a show of hands showed a slight majority in favor. So almost the internationalization didn't happen. I proposed for Leiden, going to Leiden a couple of years later in 1995, under pressure of various people, because at that point I was still in my right mind and I didn't want to do it. Jeff Chartrand, I remember Jeff Chartrand, who was very, very pushy and said, I should do it. Other candidates at that time were Birmingham, and they withdrew their bid, and Paris. And there was a vote, and one person voted for Paris, and the other delegates voted for Leiden. And you can guess who voted for Paris, of course. In that same year, there were two proposals dealing with CAA as an international organization, and I will cite again if I can find it. CAA should move towards becoming an international confederation of CAAs, with local chapters organizing meetings as required. Every 3 years, one such local meeting would be designated to the International Confederation meeting, etc., etc., etc. So in 1990, when was it? 1993 was the first signs of becoming an international confederation. In 1995, the minutes of the steering committee was then held in Leiden. The ideas for future conferences were Ljubljana, Madrid, Barcelona, the USA, and the USA with the, in between brackets, sometime in the next century. So, please not right away, sometime in the next century we shall go to the USA. 1996 was Iași in Romania, and we all agree that that was not a conference, that was an adventure. And we can talk about it for hours, but I'm not going to do that. But it was an adventure. 1997, back to the UK, Birmingham, 25 years of CAA. 1998, Barcelona, and from that day on, it really was an international conference. 1999, Dublin, 2000, Ljubljana, 2001, Visby in Sweden, 2002, Heraklion on Crete, 2003, Vienna, 2004, Prato, etc., etc., etc. But only in 2006, CAA was brave enough to leave Europe. Yep, and we went to Fargo. We made the jump over the Atlantic, which also wasn't easy and was, yeah, we had to search for a suitable candidate for a very long time, but finally somebody was brave enough to organize it there. Reading through these minutes, there were two other interesting observations I found. One is in 1988, when Sebastian Raats made a plea for conference participants to make use of electronic mail facilities. 1988, please use electronic mail facilities. And another thing that he noted was that the Southampton Bulletin Board had been temporarily suspended because of hackers. Then, 1988, already, hackers. Okay, I'd like to end with a critical note. Are we really an international organization? CAA, we're celebrating our 40 years existence now, 40 years of conferences. 20 years, we are hopping around Europe and are hopping around the globe, to America, to China. And look at the panel here. So half of it should be non-UK members. And I'm the only non-UK member. Sorry, but okay. Thank you. CAA is registered in the Netherlands. It's a Dutch organization. Yes, I did register. It's in the Netherlands while I was the secretary. So nobody knows it, but it is a Dutch organization. So I think it should be more international. And although I still have the feeling that for the time being the chair should be from the UK, but in the near future that could be an American or a German or even somebody from the Netherlands.
So I think that this is one of those international congresses which have this kind of potential, effect first of all, and potential for maintaining an international community.
Because it's in England and I'm English and live and work in England, it hasn't got the aspect of going somewhere exotic and foreign, unless you call Southampton exotic and foreign.
Partly because of computers and quantification, we are really Europeans or inhabitants of the planet, citizens of the planet.
We now move on to Clive Orton, who was the first constituted chair of CAA, and I think that happened in, when was it? I've got it in my notes. 87. 87, okay.
Right, can you hear me okay there? Okay. I want to go back a bit to what I've called the prehistory of CAA, specifically the years 66 to 71, to give you some sort of context of how things were going before CAA came upon the scene. And I should say that at that time, I was by training a mathematician, by profession a statistician, and I did archaeology as a hobby. So that's where I was coming from. And I very much represent the quantitative methods strand rather than the computing strand. I think that's important. And I want to divide that period into three phases. Archaeologists always divide things into three phases. So I thought I'd do it as well. You could regard it as sort of Stone Age, Bronze Age, and Iron Age, if you like. And the first phase was just quantitative method without the computers. And this took place at Winchester, just up the road, where I was working on the town excavations, on medieval tenements, a place called Lower Brook Street. And there was this big featureless area in the middle of all these tenements, which are called the garden or the yard. We thought, well, what do we do with this thing? So we dug it in metre squares in traditional Biddle fashion, and we had counts of sherds out of these squares. And someone noticed that there wasn't the same number of sherds in each square, and thought, well, what does this mean? So we thought a bit and did some statistics and thought, well, if the sherds were randomly scattered across this garden, they should follow what? Poisson distribution. Do they follow a Poisson distribution? No, they didn't. This is all done by hand on back of envelope stuff. Therefore, perhaps there were clusters of sherds, and perhaps these might mean something. You know, they might mean post holes or some other sort of activity. So that was really my first introduction to bringing together the two loves of my life, statistics and archaeology. Second phase, mainframe computers. And we now look at 66, 67, where I was doing my master's year at Cambridge.
I was very fortunate because Professor Roy Hodson, who was Professor of Prehistory at London, had been seconded to Cambridge for a year to learn some statistics. So he became my supervisor, and he promptly farmed me out to Barry Kemp, an Egyptologist, and said, here's a man who needs to do some statistics, give him some data. And the data I got was Egyptian cemeteries, places called Cow and Badari, and I was asked, could I seriate these things? Because seriation was the flavour of the month at the time. And we did this on the Cambridge mainframe, which was called Titan. And I think I'll take you on a little trip to visit Titan. First of all, you prepare your data, or prepare your work. And to do this, you need 3 pieces of punch tape. You need 1 punch tape with your data on, 1 punch tape with your program on, which is written in Titan autocode, and nothing is allowed to have more than 2 letters or 2 in data in autocode, and that flavour of autocode anyway, so all your variables have to have 2 letters as their name at most. And then that goes on the second piece of punch tape. Third piece of punch tape is your job description, which tells Titan what to do with the other 2 bits. You then put all these in a poly bag, and you go along to the Titan building, and come with me. You go into this big room, and the thing that strikes you first of all, it's far wall, it's covered with coat hooks, and there's a door. So you put your little poly bag on a coat hook, and go away again. If you're patient, you sit and wait to see what happens to it, and after a while, a white-coated acolyte comes out of the little door, collects all the poly bags off the coat hooks, takes them back through again, being very careful to wipe his feet, because there were actually double doors and a little lobby in between with special mats for getting the dust off your shoes as you go through so it wouldn't interfere with the computer. Titan was very sensitive. It was so sensitive that one night the entire memory got wiped out in a severe thunderstorm, which doesn't happen these days, thank God. You came back next morning. There was a huge thing. If you imagine a filing cabinet drawer, a bit bigger than a bath, okay? This thing is called the fish tank, because you have to fish around in it for your data or your results. And it's full of little folders, just like a big filing cabinet. And you fish around, and you get your stuff out again, your little bag and some pieces of paper, and it says, error on line 7. So you take it all back again to your own department, and you look through and think, now what did I do wrong in line 7? And you put that right, and the same thing happens the next day, and you get error in line 8, and so on. You get the idea. But eventually things got done. Most sophisticated thing about Titan was its system of priorities. It ran a system of priorities, so the more you used it, the lower your priority came. And if you use it really intensively, it wouldn't speak to you for a day or 2 until your priority had dropped down to an acceptable level. It sort of logged up how much work you'd done, built in an exponential decay. Until your level of usage had decayed down again, you were cut off until until it was ready for you. That was that. I then was working in the civil service, really rather busy, but doing archaeology at weekends on a site called Highgate Wood in London, where we excavated about 2 tons of Roman pottery from several kilns. And I thought, what can we do with this stuff? Crying out for analysis. And I went in for a competition. New Scientist magazine had a competition, and if you said what you wanted to do with a computer, you got a terminal and a direct line to the GEIS time-sharing computer for a year to carry out your project. And I went in for this, and much to my surprise, I won one of these 6 prizes. I do have a photo of me being given the prize by Anthony Wedgwood Benn, who was the Minister of Technology. I did bring it, but I haven't had an opportunity to show it. It shows a very young me with hair, and Anthony Wedgwood Benn handing over the prize. And we had this project which we called SUSUtv, standing for Highgate Excavations, sorting Highgate Excavations Roman debris. Shows that even then I had a passion for silly acronyms, which I still have to this day. So, I got this terminal, huge great thing. We were living in a first floor flat at the time. Delivery man had to bring it up the stairs. And I think it was going to kill him. He was struggling up the stairs with this great big terminal. And he was going redder in the face and puffing and blowing. I thought, man, this guy might have a heart attack any minute. But he didn't. He survived. We used the terminal. I moved house, and that was fun as well, moving the terminal. And I had a special phone line installed to run it. And eventually the project was done. all I'll say about the project is I wouldn't do it that way now. It was archaeologically and mathematically naive, but never mind. We got a result. We published it in World Archaeology, and I spoke about it at the Mamaia conference. No one has so far mentioned the Mamaia conference. This was the Anglo-Romanian conference, mathematics and archaeology. Mathematics in the archaeological and historical sciences. Took place in Mamaia on the Black Sea, 1971. And John and I were there, the only members of the panel who were there. And in a sense, that I think was the forerunner, the springboard, if you like, for CAA. It was noteworthy in various things. The outcomes were published very quickly. There was a lot of maths, not a lot of history, not a lot of archaeology, but an awful lot of maths in it. And it followed the philosophy that was then called hunting in pairs, which has since disappeared, which said that to do a project, you had to have a mathematician and an archaeologist working together in harness, trying to keep the thing together. It did help if they spoke to each other. It did help if they... there's a story about that which I might go into concerning the Royal Albert Hall, but that's for later, perhaps. And perhaps the most noteworthy outcome was that all the Romanians got sacked from their jobs once the conference was over for collaborating with the British. It went on for a week. I spoke about Highgate on the last day of the conference, and I showed the first slide that actually had an archaeological site in it in the whole week's archaeology conference, all the rest being very theoretical. Got an enormous round of applause for this slide of people actually digging. And I thought, this is the subject for me. You know, if you can get a cheer by showing people digging holes, this has got to be good. And then from 1971 at Mamaia, we got on to Birmingham in 1973, as you've heard about from Sue. And there we are. The rest is history. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Clive. Oh, the joys of punched cards. How many people in the audience remember punch cards or use? Oh, surprising number. Okay, weren't they awful? I can remember dropping a box of punch cards, a tin tray of my Damebury data, and it took me 2 days to sort them all out again. Anyway, we now pass on to Paul Reilly. Paul was the second chair of CAA, became chair, I think, for 92 and 93 you were chair. And Paul is renowned for inventing virtual archaeology. He always cringes when I say that, and I like to see him cringe.
Thank you, Gary. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so I'm going to just take a rifle shot at the 2 years of when CAA became international. I'd been sucked into the confluence of CAA a few years earlier. I'd done my PhD. Stafford at the time, where we had a critical mass of archaeologists who were also working with computers, was one of the few islands where you could have a group of people who could discuss semi-intelligently some of the issues that were affecting the field at the time. So when we went to CAA, my lasting impressions about why it was important and why it remains important is it gave access to a whole range of things. It gave us access to other people who were interested in the problems. It was access to people who were using different types of computers. One of the things I remember most about the sessions was everyone would stand up and say, "Oh, my machine's bigger than your machine." And I have to say, when I was chairman in 1992, my 15 minutes of glory is I definitely had the biggest machine. Power visualization system, 32A i860, 2.5 gigaflop, creamed the audience. Access to that type of technology was only available to me because I worked at IBM. So I became very aware of other issues: access to software, access to people who had training in computer techniques, access to conferences. And if you didn't have any of those things, the publications, you had to have access to understanding what came out. So access, for me, has been one of the critical journeys that I have had along the way of CAA, and I think it's the most important function of CAA. It provides this multiplicity of opinions and ways of us discussing what is happening in the world. So when I became chairman, I was particularly interested in the internationalization of the organization. So some of the people who thought about how Kazuo Ozawa came into it, I was fundamentally trying to organize to bring people in from Japan, from other places, to throw in their ideas so we'd have new bloods. So I'm sorry we've only still got one woman and one non-British person in the audience, but we should do better 20 years from now. The other thing that was important, and the reason I think it's very important for personal histories, it was transformational for me personally. So I came into a room similar to this 20 odd years ago, gave a presentation, and I was quite happy doing a PhD, working on the Isle of Man. I had access to an ICL 2966 mainframe computer, programming in Fortran G, trying to create what was now be called a proto-GIS system to analyze a problem, and somebody in IBM happened to be at the conference, and they invited me down to the Research Institute. A few years later, I was working for IBM, and my career was completely changed. My trajectory went off this way, and my career since then, which is why you've never seen me since, is I became a management consultant and a solution consultant for a multinational. So this place can change lives. I think it's a tribute to the people here and your interaction that will make a big difference. I did do some work in archaeology, and I am aware that I did coin a term called virtual archaeology, for which I'm profoundly apologetic. At the time, what I was trying to do is we had access to very advanced visualization, modeling, graphics, imaging technologies, or at least I did. And you could never show to anybody. You'd have to come to my research facility and see these images I could spin around on the screen. I could never bring it to an event like this. The buzzword at the time was virtual reality. This word was starting to appear. Now, archaeology, reality. I had a problem already at this point. So the virtual thing attached to me. And what I was trying to do is, what is a record? People around me at these meetings would challenge my view of what was happening. Leo Beek, a wonderful man who used to come to these sessions time and time again, used to challenge us in the most bizarre ways. And his last presentation about 1986 is, what is a record? Leo believed that he could be able to stand here, present some information, and he wouldn't need to publish the proceedings, because this was detrimental to what he had to say. However, it came back to the problem of presentation. And one of the things I always remember is the challenges of presentation. Leo, my last vivid memory of it, made a searing memory on my mind, is Leo was trying to get the audience to understand the power of three-dimensional visualization. However, the technology he had available was somewhat restricted. And he had two overhead projectors with acetates, which he had drawn, but we were in a small room. So Leo was projecting onto two walls which were orthogonal and inviting the audience to relax their eyes and fuse the two images. So the idea was brilliant, but the conveyancing of the idea was a little bit lacking. And this theme carried on, because I felt the same problem with my advanced computers, but shortly afterwards we had the famous Jens Andresen in Aarhus, and Jens had arrived, and he was trying to show us very large-scale images of things he was trying to classify. And he had this wall was not big enough. He had these special slides. He was projecting socketed axe heads, and the image was folding over here. He was trying to explain the level of detail he could record to. And the final one, which brings us to the access issue again for me in terms of conveying, storing, and transmitting information, was Ozawa-san. He was the professor from the University of Engineering in Osaka University, who had access to amazing resources. But he was trying to bring to a Western audience a virtual tour of Yoshinogari, which is a site in Japan. And even with the computing resources available then, to create the video, he had to have very elegant splines to model where the eye was within the model. And then render each image 25 images a second, but we couldn't do this, so it was rendered at 2 images a second. And the net effect was, you would imagine you're in a Euro fighter turning Gs, going around. And that was the highlight of, that was the pinnacle of how technology was applied. So when I came back to virtual archaeology, I was asking the question, what is archaeology? So I tried to ask a question, if I can fabricate a world which we could explore in any different way, would that challenge the way we looked at what we were doing? Would that change the methodologies we apply for exploring that world space and make it more available? So for me, CAA, if I can encapsulate what it means to me, is providing access along these multiple dimensions. That's it. Okay.
Well, I started out in this world as an electrical engineer, actually. And I did my engineering degree beginning when World War II had just ended in 1945. And during the course of getting my degree, which was awarded in 1948, the authorities of the university thought that engineers were something culturally unacceptable, so they should have at least one cultural course. And I was given a choice between human biology, I think, sociology, and archaeology. I had remembered from my school days, I didn't like cutting up frogs for biology, and I didn't know what sociology meant, so I chose archaeology. I read an article, actually in the Scientific American, about image processing of pictures, which I never heard of before. But the mathematics of it all looked exactly the same as it would have looked at for geophysics. And I went to visit in 1971. I got a grant to go to the States and went to visit various places who made the equipment that was needed. And in those days, it was possible to visit all of them because there were only 3 of them.
Yeah.
4. And decided I would get a computer for image processing, which was to deal with my archaeology, and also to deal with the geophysics data, which at that time had become a fairly large amount of stuff to process. And it took about 4 years to get various problems solved. And by 1975, in December, I think it was, 2 mini computers, not PCs, but what we call mini computers, they took up a whole room and required air conditioning, plus a scanner and a film writer were required, which in those days were pretty rare objects. And we also had a thing which was called a video display, which you could look at pictures on in real time. And it had a 512 by 512 color screen, which you can actually look at on a television set. Well, anyway, Susan had probably heard about all this activity, and by that time CAA was up, and my laboratory was pretty well established, so that by 1976 or so, it was probably the leading laboratory for computer methods in archaeology, simply because nobody else had their own computer in those days. I mean, I think I was the only museum, the only archaeological institution in Europe which had a computer. There was a computer at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington where they used punch cards to keep track of their collection. But I think mine was the first that was not designed for that purpose. In fact, we actually had to put in program with a database to keep track of the collection as well, because the money givers demanded it. But it wasn't something that ever interested me, and it doesn't interest me to this day. I am not what might be called a database person. I think in my case, rather unusually, it was a recruiting ground for personnel for my own department. I met many of the people that I wanted to hire, that I hired actually later at CAA. I didn't have to develop my own career anymore. In fact, I had enough in the way of money and resources and everything. But a lot of people, especially in the UK, but also elsewhere, were delighted to come for a stay of half a year, a year. And in those days, perhaps it's still possible, I don't know, it was very easy to get money to pay for the costs of foreigners being anyone born outside of Germany, to come and work in my department. So I had people from all over the world, actually, from the Philippines, from Japan, even one gentleman from China in those days, but he, of course, was a refugee from via Taiwan. Computers are consumer items, and like telephones used to be. And you can have a background in software and hardware that is so great that it's almost impossible to know what's going on. To just keep track of it all is very difficult. I spend at least 2 hours a day Googling around, I guess is the right word, or Wikipediaing around, and discover things almost every time I look, which I didn't know about. And, hear about things, and this has the great disadvantage, of course, that my wife gets very irritated because she can't pull me away from the machine. I made a lot of predictions in that paper. To my astonishment, after rereading it, after you sent it to me, most of them were correct. In fact, I was rather impressed with how correct they were. They were guesses. But the 1996 paper, which is the one that deals primarily with 25 years of CAA, that was a statistical analysis of the trends in archaeology, in the computing world, and what the subjects were that were favored at times. And it has a lot of graphs, or bar charts, I guess is the proper way to describe them, which shows the number of papers given on a particular set of subjects. In other words, I classified the thing into a half a dozen more subjects, and then counted the number of papers per year that appeared and produced on a bar chart showing the popularity of the subject involved in CAA up to 1996. And where those graphs have a rising tendency at that time, they have risen further still. Where those graphs have a falling tendency at that time, they have almost disappeared. Archaeology is not a driving force in these things. It's technology that is the driving force from down beneath, so to speak.
Yeah.
So the first source of development is hardware. Hardware pushes software, strangely enough, and software is then seen by people in fields that are parallel or unrelated to that which was originally developed. And then it passes, so to speak, through a long filter process to archaeology. So archaeologists are not usually state-of-the-art in terms of either software and certainly not in terms of hardware. This phenomenon is, I think, it can continue to go on. Archaeological institutions tend to develop and see things that they've seen elsewhere, like in geography departments or wherever, in the engineering departments or whatever, the university that has those things. And then they pass down and are applied in archaeology. A typical phenomenon is the fact that because hardware has become so cheap, that everybody can have one.
Yeah.
Or two, and that is the main phenomenon of our time. This is not an archaeological development. This is a manufacturing development.
And we would actually like to thank you as well. I mean, I'm in name of everyone that is part of CAA, that has been part of CAA, and I'm sure in name of all the members of our panel and our chairs and the current organizers. we'd like to thank you for all your contributions throughout the years, but also specifically for this interview. So thank you very much.
You're quite welcome, and I hope that you will be able to continue for the next 15 years or so at least. And unfortunately, I won't be around to see it, but I do wish all the best for the future and for the future of the subject, and for the fact that nowadays you can look aside as well as look forward.
Next we have Nick Ryan, and I'm sure Nick needs very little introduction. To most people in this room will know Nick because Nick has been chairman of CAA for many, many years, became chairman in 1994, I think, until last year. And so I hand over to Nick.
Okay, how's that? Audible? Yeah. I guess Paul and I are the youngsters here. Although, in some ways, I can bring out some memories of similar things to what Sue and Clive have talked about. Because my first experience of computers goes back to 1968. When I, as an undergraduate, was attempting to write a 5-line Fortran program. And here I can do better than Clive. I spent 8 days going through error on line 1, error on line 2, and so on. And I think there were 3 errors on line 3. That was the for loop. So I got every bit of the syntax completely and utterly wrong. So this rather put me off computers for a while, and as some of you will know, there were more interesting things to do in 1968. A few years later, I came back to computers because I discovered by accident mini-computers. Now, there's a funny term if there ever was one. A mini-computer, for those of you who've never seen one, in the mid-70s would stretch from here to the door, yeah? And it would be about that high. So it was just a mainframe computer just compressed into a smaller space. Massive thing by modern standards. And I played around with those with paper tape now and then, actually use quite illegally, using some that some friends of mine had access to, and so on. And then I went off and became an archaeologist. And I did that for a few years. And then all of a sudden, microcomputers came along. And microcomputers, very stunning things with 4-bit words. And quite amazing what you could do with 4-bit words. I mean, things got even better. We got 8-bit words a bit later. And at about that time, I went to join John at Stafford, and this microcomputer, when it wasn't running about in the back of his camper van, was getting used by several of us here for all sorts of strange and nefarious purposes. And Julian Richards was managing to draw Saxon pots on them. Now, of course, with mainframe computers, you have things like plotters and so on, kept by those acolytes that Clive described, that could draw things for you. But with microcomputers, there wasn't much you could do in the way of drawing. So one of the first things I did when I was at Stafford was to write a printer driver for a daisy wheel printer. Anyone remember daisy wheel printers? Apart from Julian, yeah? Okay. Now, what this did was it used the full stop and very careful control of the position of the print head and the carriage to draw graphics. And one wonderful system. The trouble was we had to replace the daisy wheel once a week because the full stop fell off. Anyway, more seriously, about the same time, I attended my first CAA, and I'm still not absolutely certain whether it was 81 or 82, but I know, because I have the evidence, that I presented a paper at the 82 conference, and I have the evidence with me here, I have the conference badge, a historical artifact in its own right, which should go into the CAA archive, I think. And that was my first experience of CAA, and it was, as Sue has described, a single-room gathering, fairly full of people, some degree of international presence, but generally people who knew each other from around the UK. Well, things went on, and there are so many things you could say about what happened in subsequent years, but a lot of it's been said already. What happened later on? We went through this process of becoming international, as Hans has described, after that first conference in Aarhus, and in many ways, I think it's a lot of the international conferences that have given me some of my best memories, and some of the things that come to mind are some of the dinners and some of the trips that we've been on. I'm sure I can leave it to others to describe one very memorable Southampton trip and dinner. I'll leave it to others to describe because, quite simply, I have no memory of it whatsoever. I'm told about it many times, and I'm asked to comment on it many times, and I simply cannot remember anything about it. But more memorable to me, that first international dinner at Aarhus. Quite a stunning event that was, complete with after-dinner films that the BBC could never show, and indeed rather eventful coach journey back to the hotels when some members of the assembled multitude were, shall we say, rather unwell. Trips have always been, well, not always, but for a very long time, and I think going back to the early days, trips to archaeological sites of interest and so on have always been a key element of CAA, and the ones that I remember most of all are 1996, the one in Yash, where we spent a day in a rather rickety old coach with not glass bottles but large 2-litre Coke bottles full of some stuff which, if they'd use it to fuel the coach would have travelled twice as quickly as it did. Quite dangerous stuff. I mean, I really can't imagine the precautions that would be necessary to transport that material around in this country today. Yet, apart from sampling this strange fluid in these Coke bottles, we had some wonderful times looking around the painted monasteries in deep snow, and so on. And another which comes to mind is the trip from the first American conference at Fargo, coach tour across. Well, it seemed almost like half of North America, but I'm sure it was a good deal less than that. But that was a very enjoyable trip with yes, exactly, the constant supply of Bloody Marys from the icebox, which I'm sure made the distances a lot more acceptable than they might otherwise have been. So, yeah, I mean, I've chosen those couple of trips, but there are many more that are memorable as well. So we've gone from this local but increasingly international conference to one which has an international venue, to one which now has an intercontinental venue. And so having handed the chair over to Gary, it's now his job to make it intergalactic or whatever. I mean, Paul started the international. It was well, perhaps increase the number of continents, if nothing else. I mean, we've got another continent next year, haven't we? So, Okay, I mean, that's pretty much all I want to say, except perhaps there's been mention of a number of our Japanese colleagues, who the contacts with began with Paul, and a number of us have had contacts with a number of people in Japan over the years. I guess my main regret is that we've not yet had a CAA in Japan, because there is still a good deal of work going on out there, and it would be nice to see some more of that. Okay.
It's been a really strange conference for me in a sense, because whenever I've attended the CAA in the past, I've always been trying to get into as many interesting sessions as possible, but being one of the organisers, that hasn't really been an option this year, because I've been running around trying to solve problems and help people find things and stuff like that. So in a weird way, I've just spent the entire time talking to people, which has been really nice, because it's given me an opportunity to get to know people that I might not have been able to speak to otherwise. And with 8 parallel sessions at the CAA, it's impossible to see everything. And so I think, strangely, as one of the organisers, it's given me a sort of unique overview, really, which would have been very hard to get if I'd just been attending lectures. Yeah.
I've only been able to attend one day of it, I'm afraid. It seems to compare favourably. I haven't noticed any horrible mistakes in the organisation. It seems to be running very smoothly and everybody seems to be enjoying it.
Facilities, it's very, very well organised, and what I really like is that the organisers have introduced a whole range of innovative things to this conference. I mean, the social media and all those sorts of things. You know, it's the first time that's really taken off at a CAA.
Bringing the venue to prestigious universities, places of excellence in computer-based archaeology, is clearly a great move. People have the infrastructure to hold a congress, and it has the prestige to bring people in. So this is definitely up there with the best I've been to.
Okay, thank you very much, Nick. Can everyone still hear that? Yeah. Okay, it's my turn now. So I'm just going to say a few things, and then we hand it over to you, and it's your turn to contribute. I first went to CAA in 1980. I was doing a PhD at John's Research Centre, and I must admit, for the first few years at CAA, I sort of felt a bit of a fraud, really, because I wasn't that interested in computers, to be honest. I mean, I could see the potential, and, you know, being at the Research Centre for Computer Archaeology, I felt sort of obliged to use computers. But I just finished a degree in archaeology at Leicester University, and if I'm absolutely honest, what I really wanted to do is to work in a museum. But in those days, you couldn't get on a museum studies course. They were far too few and far between, and getting into a museum was difficult. And I saw this advert for a research council-funded place at the Stafford Centre for Computer Archaeology, and I applied for it, and I was interviewed. And I'm not sure whether John will confirm this or not, but as far as I know, I was third choice, and the first 2 turned it down. So that sort of says something, I think, about the perception of computer archaeology in those days. That was 1979. So anyway, I got that post, and of course I'm now very, very grateful. And started going to CAA. But my memories of those early CAAs, 1980 and the early 80s, is that they was pretty much dominated by databases and statistical methods, you know, which were sort of interesting. And indeed, I used to program in COBOL. I don't know if any of you remember COBOL. Wonderful language, very verbose, very wordy. And I used to share an office with a woman named Naomi, and we used to speak to each other in COBOL. And I particularly remember one bit of code that we used quite often, which was, if hungry, go to canteen. And quite often we'd get it stuck in a loop, I must admit, and we'd spend a lot of time in the canteen. But anyway, a life-changing CAA for me was 1986. So I was going every year to CAA with a whole group of us from Stafford. And of course, the social aspect of it was great. The social aspect of CAA has always been wonderful, I think. But in 1986, I don't know if any of you were there then, a man named Trevor Harris, who was a geographer, stood up and he gave a paper on GIS. And pretty much nobody had ever heard of GIS in 1986. And he stood up and he said, this is something called GIS, it's pretty new. If any of you have got an idea how this can be used in archaeology, come and talk to me. I went and talked to him. And my career took a completely different turn then. I mean, that's when I became interested in GIS, and Trevor and I have worked together ever since, really. We've written lots of papers together on GIS, and it's something that I've become very interested in. So the point I'm making is that, as indeed Paul said, CAA can have life-changing effects and impacts on people, I think, as indeed it did with me. And I've sort of, one of the things that's always interested me about CAA, and it's very much to the fore, I think, for many of us, and I think many of you will agree with this, is we all use computers in our everyday archaeological work. But a big question for me is when does research become the everyday? And it's a very blurred boundary. You know, so, I mean, I'm sure we've all been to papers at CAA where we think, yes, that's very interesting, but is it really research? Is there anything new in it? Perhaps I'm being a bit contentious saying this. But certainly, you know, in 1986, GIS was new and it was research. But these days, pretty much everybody is using GIS. But I would question what is the actual research component of some of those papers. So that boundary between the everyday use and research, I think, is one that really intrigues me about CAA and the sorts of things that we hear going on at CAA. So sociability and the multidisciplinarity of CAA are two things that really stick out for me and make it something very special. Not just computer scientists and statisticians, but environmentalists, geographers, historians, all sorts of people come to CAA now, and it's absolutely great, and I love it. I wasn't going to raise the alcohol element of CAA, but being as Nick already has, the story that sticks out in my mind, and it's to do with the field trip, is the one at Aarhus. Jens Andersen and Torsten Madsen organised a trip, and we went out fairly early in the morning, and we arrived at quite a big megalithic tomb. Fantastic monument, megalithic tomb. I can see nods here. And there was a big bunch of us, a couple of coachloads of us, and we went into this megalithic tomb. And Torsten had been there the day before, and he'd hidden in the chamber of this megalithic tomb these bottles of this stuff, I don't know what it was, that apparently the Danes drink for breakfast. What was it called? Sorry? Right, that's the one. And anyway, he had these little plastic cups, and there we all were at sort of 8:30 in the morning, standing around in a field at a megalithic tomb, knocking back this stuff. In a snowstorm, indeed, in a snowstorm, yeah. So field trips are hugely important, I think. I mean, any of us who teach archaeology will know this anyway. You know, the best way to bring a group together is to take them out on a field trip and show them things and have a good walk around a field or something. So that's important to me. Sociability, multidisciplinarity, field trips. And I think CAA is just a wonderful community. I mean, it has always been the place to go if you want to meet people interested in computers and archaeology and a whole range of other disciplines. I mean, I think it's just unbeatable. And I'm not just saying that because I'm now the chair of it, but I really believe that. Okay, thank you very much. That's all I want to say.